We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
Art is the space between angels and demons. Marshall Arisman. I encountered this quote a few years ago on a subway platform in Brooklyn. While waiting for the F train one morning, I spotted a poster that featured an evocative and, quite frankly, terrifying pair of paintings by Marshall Arisman. I had never heard of the artist, but I could see, based on the images, that he was someone I might want to know. Sandwiched between the two paintings was that quote, "Art is the space between angels and demons," which the poster attributed to the artist. The poster identified Mr. Arisman as the chair of the MFA program in Illustration as Visual Essay at the School of Visual Arts, for which this poster, it became clear to me, was an advertisement. Good marketing, I thought. A captivating bit of text attached to a pair of striking images, and the brand identity slipped in there so inconspicuously that it's not even clear at first that what you're looking at is an advertisement. It just looks like a piece of art. I found myself intrigued. I hadn't heard of the SVA, so I scampered over to the stairwell where I got a signal on my phone. I looked it up and discovered that it's a private, for-profit art and design college in Manhattan. I went back to the platform and studied the poster until my train came, then contemplated its meaning and its implications on my commute into the city. To begin with, what would a graduate program in Illustration as Visual Essay entail? To understand that, we need to back up a few decades. Back in the 1970s, the newly conceived op-ed page took hold in big city newspapers, altering the face and, in some ways, the heart of American journalism. It may be hard to imagine a time before op-eds blanketed not only our newspapers, but our news feeds. But while it had its antecedents, the form was an innovation introduced by John B. Oakes in the New York Times in 1970. As media historian Michael J. Sokolov points out, the op-ed page was partly a means of democratizing cultural and political discourse, and partly a response to the economic pressures print news outlets faced with mounting competition from TV and radio. From the beginning, the op-ed format carried both an air of free-thinking idealism and a whiff of corruption, with journalists taking aim at the Times for their failure to disclose potential conflicts of interest and offering up space for commentary to anyone who could pay the premium fees. But in spite of any objections from the old guard, the new form was here to stay. It didn't take the team at the Times long to realize that the engaging and provocative text of the op-ed page deserved equally engaging and provocative images to accompany it. This is where Marshall Arisman came into the picture. A classically trained painter, at the age of 30, Arisman was hired by Jean-Claude Suarez, the first art director of the New York Times, to create images that contained some kind of social commentary or resonated with current events and concerns, often with little editorial oversight. As described in a profile by Jarrell Krauss in the retrospective All the Art That's Fit to Print and Some That's Not, the Times deputy editor would give Arisman 5 stories and tell him to pick one to provide an illustration for, promising that he would be paid even if the story didn't run. Arisman turned out a string of complex and provocative images, making incisive graphic commentaries on the pressing socio-political issues of the day. It wasn't what some of Arisman's friends or colleagues or mentors would have deemed fine art, but it suited him just fine. Years after he had established himself as one of the central figures in American op-ed art, Arisman joined the faculty of the newly established School of Visual Art in Manhattan, creating the MFA program in Illustration as Visual Essay. It's been almost 5 years since I saw that poster for the SVA on the train platform in Brooklyn, but the image of it has stayed with me, along with the questions I asked myself on the train. To begin with, who or what are these angels and demons Arisman is referring to, and what does it mean to say that art is the space between them? Well, contemplating this question brought another opposition to mind, not between angels and demons, but between art and commerce. The message was delivered, after all, in the context of a corporate advertisement. And that got me thinking. What lies at the intersection of art and commerce? The world of finance and the world of creative ideas no doubt influence one another, but is it possible for these two realms to meet in a way that is mutually beneficial in pursuit of a shared aim? Or does the one inevitably suffer when it's asked to serve the other's agenda? Is the intersection between art and commerce a place we should want to go? Or is it something to be avoided? I'm Greg Beam, and this is Quite Useless. Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. Each episode, I take on a different topic in the arts, trying to gain a better understanding about the nature and purpose of artistic creation and contemplation. Today I'm looking at the relationship between art and commerce, how money and creative ideas correspond and potentially conflict with one another. Money is, in one sense, very important to every artist I know, including myself. The reason for this is very simple. Artists, like everyone, like to eat food and sleep under a roof that doesn't leak and provide for our families, frivolous stuff like that. Beyond that, however, it gets tricky and ambiguous and contentious. Artists must make endless decisions and negotiations pertaining to how they want to create, distribute, and market their work, how they will allow it to be used and by whom. And every one of these decisions and negotiations comes packed with an untidy bundle of prickly questions about principles and practicality. Music journalism and the fiction drawn from it abounds with stories of artists selling out. That is, making decisions about how to balance their fidelity to their personal vision with their commercial viability that some might perceive as cynical or greedy. I almost did a whole long aside here about the singer Liz Phair, but this episode is already long enough, so I'll leave you to look up her story on your own. Anyway, this phenomenon isn't limited to music. You can find similar tales in other art forms, from struggling screenwriters making story concessions in order to get a script sold, to visual artists accepting questionable commissions. For a case study that I find particularly interesting, you might have a listen to episode 4 of the first season of Quite Useless, The Rambo Effect. We might be tempted to think that this is a unique perversion of our time, the corrupting influence of capitalism on artistic expression. But the truth is, the influence of money on art is nothing new. Since the dawn of civilization, artists have had to contend with finances, and financial pressures have influenced the way they went about creating their art. Art costs money to make. You need to acquire the tools and materials of your craft, and you need to be able to survive while devoting thousands of hours to learning and then practicing whatever art form you've chosen. For centuries, artists relied on patrons to subsidize their endeavors, sometimes in the form of commissions for individual works, and sometimes in the form of more ongoing support. There is some debate among art historians about exactly how much control patrons exerted over the artwork they commissioned. We do know that patrons during the Renaissance often dictated themes and subject matters, along with the locations where paintings were to be made. Think of Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. And there are documented cases when patrons were rather specific about what they wanted to see in painting. The painting Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez is one of the most studied works of the Renaissance. There is still an extraordinary amount of speculation and debate about the work's construction, themes, and even what it actually depicts. Anne Carson delivers a fascinating meditation on the use of perspective in Las Meninas in her book Eros the Bittersweet, which I'll be discussing in a later episode. But for now, I want to focus our attention on a more concrete element of the painting. There's a dog lying on the floor. If you're analyzing the painting and wondering what this pooch signifies, you might imagine it's a symbol of fidelity, as he patiently tolerates being lightly trodden upon by one of the people in the scene. That old stereotypical canine name Fido actually comes from the Latin verb to believe, or to trust. And if you so speculated, you would be right. That is what the dog symbolizes. But as my colleague Melissa Warwick, whom I interviewed in the episode Long Arcs, pointed out to me, it probably wasn't Velázquez's idea to put it in there. The figures present in the painting were likely selected by Velázquez's patron, the King of Spain, who would have told the artist what he wanted to see in his painting, and there was no question that the painting would belong to the king, not to Velázquez. Was Velázquez a genius who rendered the scene in a brilliant and mystifying way? No doubt. but the content of the scene wasn't his to choose. It even seems that the painting was embellished either by King Philip IV or at his behest after Velázquez's death. Now, we may be inclined to question or even discard these stories about Velázquez and the king, or to imagine that it's an atypical example. But even if we take a rather generous view of patronage, imagining that patrons by and large extended a good deal of latitude to the artists they sponsored, it's reasonable to suspect that the artists would know where their support was coming from, and would tailor and constrain their creative expression so as not to bite the hand that fed them. It's likely no accident, for instance, that Shakespeare's history plays tend to legitimize and in some ways glorify the Tudor dynasty, painting their enemy Richard III as a villain. The reigning monarch, Elizabeth I, supported Shakespeare's work, and she was a Tudor. Samuel Johnson defined a patron as one who countenances, supports, and protects, but also as commonly a wretch who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery. But while the influence of economic forces on art is nothing new, there was a sea change around the turn of the 20th century, a multifaceted upheaval that radically altered both the conventions and public conceptions of a number of different art forms, along with how art operated in society. I discussed some aspects of this revolution in the very first episode of Quite Useless Long Arcs, but there I focused mostly on the effect of technology on the arts, how electronic stage lighting and other effects laid the foundation for theatrical realism, how the twin inventions of the photographic camera and the phonograph led to divergent trends in visual art and music, and of course brought us the new medium of film. And while I stand by my assessment that technological development was a critical factor, perhaps the critical factor, in the transition into the modern era in the arts, there was also a seismic shift happening in the way that art was funded, dating back to the mid-1800s. What happened in the 19th century, as the effects of the Industrial Revolution fanned out over Europe and the Americas, is that a new middle class emerged, the bourgeoisie Karl Marx had so much to say about. These people had disposable incomes, money they wanted to spend on luxuries and status symbols, including art. A market developed around fine art, a kind of market that had never existed before. Paintings had, in the past, been bought and sold, but nothing on this order. Some artists found this development liberating. They were glad to slough off the suffocating constraints of patronage. No longer did a painter require the graces of a wealthy individual or the imprimatur of an established institution to get his art out into the world. The groundbreaking realistic painter Gustave Courbet was an early embracer of market-driven art. Long at odds with the tastes and standards of the established arbiters of fine art in France, Courbet sought alternative means of showing his art to potential viewers and buyers. With the help of his friend Alfred Boyat, Courbet set up an alternative venue for viewing the work of young artists whose work was too unconventional for the salon. Courbet was reacting to centuries of rigorous artistic conservatism in France, notably exemplified by the Académie Française, which dictated strict compositional and stylistic standards for any work of literature published in French. For Courbet, the liberality of the market represented an antidote and alternative to this rigid, stagnant approach to the curation and cultivation of the arts. By the early 20th century, though, artists had come to realize that an open market didn't represent the panacea for artists that Boyat and Courbet had envisioned. The new dynamics had given rise to a consumerist fervor among the collecting set. Gone were the rarefied breed of aristocrats and connoisseurs. Now you had social climbers wishing to feather their caps, purchasing art not because of how it spoke to them, but because it was the latest thing. Or else, because it might prove a good long-term investment. Some artists responded subversively to this new development. In 1917, Marcel Duchamp blew a raspberry at the world of fine art with his work Fountain, in which he took a men's urinal and put it on display in a gallery, calling it a ready-made sculpture. His strategy backfired. People loved the work. They thought it was impossibly clever, brilliant even, and beautiful. Duchamp later said, "I threw the urinal into their faces as a challenge, and now they admire it for its aesthetic beauty." You can still see replicas of Fountain, the original has been lost, in the halls of art museums. It's deemed one of the most significant works of the early 20th century. Duchamp wasn't the sole purveyor of such antics. Almost a century before Banksy had one of his most famous paintings self-destruct, only to become more valuable, as it turns out, Francis Picabia conducted his own little demonstration of ars ad nihilo. Invited by his friend André Breton to attend an event hosted by a group of Dadaists, including Tristan Tzara, Picabia unveiled a chalkboard with a new drawing he had made. After the crowd was allowed to see it for a couple of minutes, Breton promptly grabbed an eraser and swept it over the chalkboard, eliminating the work before the stunned onlookers. It was pure Dada, in keeping with that school's penchant for undermining the commodification of art. The artist himself, Picabia, had a more ambivalent attitude toward commercialization. He chose his own nom de clé, Picabia, in part because of its advertising potential, a theme explored in Aurélie Verdier and Claude Kincaid's article, Picabia's Quasi-Name. Of course, the 20th century's most celebrated consorts between fine art and advertising came a few decades later, at the hands of Andy Warhol, who, beyond turning logos and other popular relics of his age into gallery fodder, drew little distinction between artistic and commercial endeavors. He went so far as to call business the greatest of the arts. But whether artists tolerated the presence of market forces in the art world, rebelled against it, or, like Andy Warhol, swam blithely in the estuarial waters of art and commerce, there was no denying that in the 20th century, the world of fine art had undergone a fundamental shift, not only by dint of the fact that art was now on the open market, but because of the reciprocal role that artists played in response to this fact. Artists were now engaged in social commentary and criticism. Many, if not most, accepted this as their new mandate, their raison d'art, if you will. For his part, Marshall Ehresmann flourished in the market-driven but socially conscious environment of the late 20th century. And not just because of his wit and skill as a social commentator, and his work in this vein really is quite stunning. He flourished as a so-called commercial artist, an artist for hire, someone for whom making illustrations was a stable profession and not a feast or famine proposition. He worked for the New York Times for many years, positioning himself as one of the foremost illustrators in print journalism and racking up numerous accolades and awards along the way. This was a liberation. It didn't hurt that the journalistic culture at the time was one of allowing artists to do what they do rather than issuing dictates from on high. We can see parallels to this in other creative realms in the 1970s, notably the legendary generation of new Hollywood film directors. It was a time that a lot of folks wish we could return to, a brief hiatus in the mechanism of the conventional power structures, an inversion of the conventional decision-making paradigm, a time when the demands of art moved the wheels of industry, rather than the other way around. Now, I'm a child of the 80s, and while there are plenty of things about the 70s, like bell-bottoms and 8-balls, that I don't regret missing, this short-lived elevation and liberation of the creative in the heart of our capitalist machinery is something I wish I could have witnessed firsthand. Now, maybe I have an unrealistically rosy view of the creative culture of the 1970s, but according to accounts like those in All the Art That's Fit to Print, along with Peter Biskin's rollicking portrayal of 70s-era Hollywood in his book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, there might be something to the notion that the 70s represented something of a lacuna, a momentary reprieve from the mounting corporatization of art. That period may have demonstrated that, even if it's difficult to sustain over the long term, a commercial paradigm for production doesn't have to be at odds with artistic innovation or integrity. Ehresmann, quoting sculptor David Smith, defines commercial art as art that's made for someone else, while fine art satisfies the artist's own needs or proclivities. Viewed that way, there may be something to be said for commercial art. A certain generosity, a lack of self-involvement or self-indulgence. And it wouldn't be surprising then if works created in that mode with the audience in mind would do more for that audience. In Ehresmann's case, it's really a distinction without a difference, as he points out that the Times was paying him to make art that he would have been making for himself anyway. It's not surprising, then, that he would have relished the opportunity to spend much of his career creating so-called commercial art. He says of being employed by the Times, "They gave me complete freedom." But before this discussion turns into one big love-in, I should say that there is a further distinction to be made among kinds of commercial art, one that Ehresmann fails to make, at least in the accounts I've read. But before I make that distinction, I want to take a step back, a big step back. I want to return to the notion that got this whole thing spinning in my head in the first place, that proposition by Marshall Ehresmann, that art is the space between angels and demons. Ehresmann's recent studio work has been dominated by the subject of angels and demons. His website, MarshallEhresmannAngelsDemons.com, divides his paintings into those two categories. In an interview, he said that he has the angels up on one wall and the demons up on another, so that when he's working, he is literally occupying the space between them. And we might want to think of the space between angels and demons as the place we all occupy, our everyday lives. But while there may be music and poetry in the rhythms of daily life, that is not what Ehresmann's paintings evoke. His work suggests extremities of torment, chaos, conflict, the monstrous merging and hybridizing of forms, Ovidian transformations. There's a conflation of categories here. Ehresmann's angels are a bit frightening and his demons rather beautiful. And I think he means for there to be some intermingling of the angelic and demonic qualities among his figures, something in the vein of Ovid, as I mentioned, but also of William Blake. Blake's book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, explores these themes and predicts some of the central strains of modern aesthetics, and Ehresmann's paintings, in my view, owe a considerable debt to Blake's artwork. In a short article on the SVA's website, Ehresmann attributes the inspiration for the quote to his grandmother, a noted psychic who told him that he must learn to stand in the space between the angels and demons, both of which would try to seduce him. This dovetails with a quote from Alan Watts that's featured prominently on Ehresmann's website. Describing Buddhist cosmology and ethics, Watts writes, "All forms of Buddhism subscribe to the middle way between the extremes of angel, deva, and demon, preta, ascetic and sensualist, and claim that supreme awakening, or Buddhahood, can be attained only from the human state." Now, Watts's translation of the descriptive designations of deva and preta into the morally loaded terms angel and demon is slippery at best. This is something I'll be investigating in a later episode. But the point that Watts is trying to make does lend some insight into Ehresmann's proposed space between angels and demons. In this view, what Ehresmann is referring to is the human realm, the realm of understanding where sensual reality is intermingled with spiritual potential, and the only realm where Buddha's middle way is possible. The space between angels and demons, then, is the realm of human experience, and Ehresmann wants to equate that arena with art. This resonates in a certain way with Andy Warhol, who viewed every manner of human endeavor as potentially artistic, notably business. And there is a long tradition, going back at least to Sun Tzu's Art of War, of attributing aesthetic properties to aspects of human life that may seem on the surface to be anathema to the practice of art. Art, in this view, is a kind of inflection, a hue or quality with which life may be imbued when approached in a certain way and regarded from a particular point of view. I'll tell you, though, that while I find this concept captivating and compelling, I'm inclined to phrase it a bit differently than Ehresmann does. Rather than saying that art is the space between angels and demons, I might say that art collapses the space between angels and demons, or taking a cue from William Blake, that art is the space where angels and demons meet, mingle, and even merge. Or perhaps that angels and demons don't even dwell in separate spaces, but are complementary inclinations within us, and that art captures and expresses their continual interaction. To paraphrase Tom Waits, if we exorcise our demons, our angels may leave too. Art, we might say, is the arena in which our angels and demons come together to dance. This arena lives in the human mind and is enacted in the external world through craft, the sensory and material expression of art. Movement within this arena depends on the continual interplay between order and chaos. This interplay of order and chaos, what Nietzsche calls the Apollonian and Dionysian tendencies, an analog to the cosmic yin and yang of Buddhism, this interplay is the perennial creative principle. It is what begot us and the process by which we, in turn, beget new things. Angels and demons are metaphors we use for the natural forces of order, angels, and chaos, demons, organization and entropy, the sublime stillness that William Blake labels heaven, and the surging ecstasies he calls hell. Angels and demons are figures we create to point to the organic forces that created us and that abide within us. Being our creations, angels and demons are in fact not celestial, transcendent, or infernal entities. To borrow a phrase from Nietzsche, they are human, all too human. Of course, nothing I've just said on this subject is pithy enough to be printed on an expensive ad posted in a New York City subway station. Nothing I have said is copyworthy. And this points to the reason that I keep circling around Erisman on this point, even though he and I might have a similar affinity for and attitude toward the presence and purposes of art in human life. The reason I keep splitting these hairs, why I'm grinding this point into the ground, the reason I have sat on this subject for 5 frickin' years, and am now devoting an unusually long episode of my podcast to it, is that Erisman expressed this view in a poster advertising a private, for-profit college. I was myself at the time teaching at a private, for-profit art school. The first time I saw that poster, I was either on my way to class or to an audition for a commercial. And while I valued the time I spent with my students at that institution, the experience made me skeptical of the whole enterprise of for-profit arts education. Now, I'm not out to knock the School of Visual Arts. It seems to be a respectable institution with numerous alumni of Erisman's program having gone on to successful careers as illustrators. But that poster still gives me pause because while there may have been art involved in its creation and presentation, the thing itself was not a piece of art, but an agent of commerce. Something shifts when you move education into the realm of commerce, something that may not be evident on the surface but which can be felt in its essence, and I think the same may be true when art is transposed into the context of business or industry. A for-profit educational institution operates under a fundamentally different mandate than a not-for-profit college or university, be it public or private. The students who shell out tens of thousands of dollars a year to attend a for-profit college are consumers who bring with them all the expectations of a consumer of any service. And as my first boss at the for-profit college where I worked told me on my first day, the instructors occupy something of a customer service position. So, to make the distinction at last that I promised a while ago, there's a difference between art that's intended to be regarded, contemplated, consumed, whatever, as art, or even as entertainment, where the end goal is the experience of the work, regardless of how it's funded, and art that is being used to sell something else. Art as advertisement is a presence that has become so pervasive in our society, ubiquitous really, that it may be difficult for us even to notice it. It is the air we breathe, the constant background noise in our homes and workplaces and everywhere we go. It's almost impossible for us to imagine a world where art and artists aren't being used to sell us things. And this is a distinction that Erisman's favorable view of commercial art and the School of Visual Arts' use of art to grease the wheels of commerce fails to account for. Tom Waits has perhaps gone further than any other popular artist in resisting and speaking out against this red tide of advertisement that threatens to overtake us. He steadfastly refuses to license his music for commercial use and has successfully sued those who use his songs, or even his signature sound. And then, like the class act he is, he's given the money he wins to charity. Waits once said, "Apparently the highest compliment our culture grants artists nowadays is to be in an ad, ideally naked and purring on the hood of a new car. I have adamantly and repeatedly refused this dubious honor." Elsewhere, he said that he would rather receive a hot lead enema than have one of his songs appear in a commercial. It's a misuse, a misappropriation of art to use it to sell things. If nothing else, it's just icky. Art as advertisement is not art. Now, to be clear, the distinction I'm making is not one between so-called high art and more popular forms. I share Marshall Arisman's annoyance at how, as he puts it, the fine art world stigmatizes people for illustrating. I'm not concerned with how highbrow or lowbrow a work is. I like to tell my film students that it doesn't matter to me what they're watching. I'm more concerned about how they're watching it. Nor is my concern with whether or how an artist is getting paid. I like it when artists are paid for their work. What I'm really concerned with is the agenda the work serves. Art may be intended for a mainstream audience or for a niche audience, and, I will as often as not prefer the former. But when art is created for or put to a use that is principally commercial, that use perverts its essence. It transforms it into something else. Any value that it may have is inherently different from art that is created principally for the edification of artist and audience. In his essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, originally titled Shipping Out on the Nearly Lethal Comforts of a Luxury Cruise, David Foster Wallace discusses and quotes extensively from an essay-mercial written by the esteemed author Frank Conroy in praise of the cruise line Wallace's own essay spends 30,000 plus words reporting on. Conroy had been hired by the company's PR department to pen a review of the cruise that is as insistently eloquent as it is emphatically, almost embarrassingly, adulatory. The cruise line, by Wallace's account, slips Conroy's review into its brochure so as to pass it off as an unsolicited piece of praise, with nary a mention of its having been commissioned from the writer for a pretty penny. Wallace is distressed by the positioning of a commercial item as an authentic piece of communication from an artist. He finds this disingenuous and dangerous. He writes, "Celebrity Cruises is presenting Conroy's review as an essay, and not a commercial. This is extremely bad. Here is the argument for why it's bad. Whether it honors them well or not, an essay's fundamental obligations are supposed to be to the reader. The reader, on however unconscious a level, understands this, and thus tends to approach an essay with a relatively high level of openness and credulity. But a commercial is a very different animal. Advertisements have certain formal legal obligations to truthfulness, but these are broad enough to allow for a great deal of rhetorical maneuvering in the fulfillment of an advertisement's primary obligation, which is to serve the financial interests of its sponsor. Whatever attempts an advertisement makes to interest and appeal to its readers are not, finally, for the reader's benefit. And the reader of an ad knows all this too, that an ad's appeal is by its very nature calculated. And this is part of why our state of receptivity is different, more guarded, when we get ready to read an ad. This is the reason why even a really beautiful, ingenious, powerful ad, of which there are a lot, can never be any kind of real art. An ad has no status as gift, i.e., it's never really for the person it's directed at. For his part, Conroy told Wallace, "I prostituted myself." There's a whole school of critical thought which holds that an artist's intentions don't really matter. a position expressed by W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley in their article The Intentional Fallacy. Writing of poetry specifically, they assert that a poem simply works in artfully expressing a complex of meaning, or it doesn't. The artist's intentions can only be gleaned from if and how the poem works, and don't bear on whether or how the poem is effective. This episode isn't the place to unpack and respond to those authors' complete argument, but for now, let's just say that I don't find their theory terribly convincing. The idea that a work of art should work irrespective of its context, including the known or inferred intention of the creator, is noble in a way and appealing, but a bit naive. It ignores the whole network of cultural, socio-political, economic, and historical factors at work both in the act of creation and of contemplation. It is simply impossible for works of art to exist or for us to encounter them independent of an infinitely branching matrix of contextual factors influencing our experience of the work. In the previous episode, The Use of the Useless, I advocated an unmediated encounter with works of art, bypassing the prefaces and placards that so intellectualize the facts surrounding a work and its creator as to turn the work into an artifact, divesting it of its vital properties, neutralizing the living, spontaneous encounter with the person contemplating it. With this sudden emphasis on context, I may seem to be contradicting myself, and there are a few ways I could respond. The first might be to punt the objection by conjuring Whitman. I contradict myself? Well, I contradict myself. I am large and contain multitudes. Or perhaps I could say that these two tendencies toward immediate engagement and considered contextualization are the aesthetic corollary of those Apollinian and Dionysian impulses I mentioned earlier, the yin and the yang of the experience of contemplating art. But what I really want to say is that art is a wildly complex and variegated phenomenon. In fact, a whole multidimensional network of phenomena. And while that direct, unmediated experience of art in creation and contemplation is critical to its operation in our minds, hearts, and spirits, there is a whole other plane, a kind of superstratum, in which creative ideas form a kind of mesh that frames our lives, our interactions, our opinions and principles. And with respect to this level of organization, I would say that context is very, very important, and that one aspect of the context in which a work of art reaches us has to do with the intentions behind it. Not only the intentions of the creator, but of the person or entity that commissions and or distributes the work. Intentions matter. They're not the only thing that matters in addressing a work of art. There are myriad other factors that enter into a work's meaning and effect. But intentions do matter. An artist's aim, real or perceived, establishes a set of expectations in the view of the person perceiving whatever it is they have created. A contract, we might call it. There is no guarantee that an artist's work will speak to, much less satisfy, an individual reader, viewer, listener. But there is a tacit understanding that a good faith effort has been made to communicate something worth communicating. No such understanding exists in the realm of commerce, regardless of the quality of the communication. That is, however well calculated it may be to elicit the desired response from the consumer. Without getting into a whole Marxist analysis here, I think we can say that there is a kind of alienation that happens when something art-like is created to serve commercial ends, a distancing and denaturing that renders it something other than real art, that turns it into design, copy, messaging. I must confess, however, that even as I make this argument, I feel a bit tentative and conflicted about it. Because I realize that the intersection, or even the merging, of art and commerce isn't entirely a fiction, a fantasy dreamed up by ad executives. It might, in fact, be converging around a term that now seems ubiquitous in our culture: content. Content is a word that disguises all manner of sins and virtues, leveling the playing field for angels and demons, eliminating expectations, voiding any contract, real or perceived, between creator and consumer, two other C words that ought to give us pause. We may be entering an era when there are no longer any artists, only creatives. No longer any audiences, only consumers. Perhaps art is the space between angels and demons, and it is a space that is becoming so overpopulated by lifeless, flattened content that it is impossible to tell the infernal from the divine. This episode of Quite Useless was written, recorded, produced, performed, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. I also made all the music. You can find every episode of Quite Useless on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or the website, thisisquiteuseless.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to drop me a line, I'm on Twitter @QUPodcast. Subscribe, download, enjoy. Quick note on the previous episode, the use of the useless. I compared the philosophy of Tao Master Zhuangzi to the Stoics who were active in Greece at the time. I realized after that this wasn't the most apt comparison I could have made. Really, the brand of Taoism expressed by Zhuangzi's predecessor Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching is more akin to Stoicism, while Zhuangzi's more radical and somewhat gonzo style has its Hellenistic counterpart in Pyrrhonian skepticism, if anything. I thought it was a distinction worth making. I'll be back in a few weeks with reference to yet another school of ancient philosophy and how it might reflect on modern art. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more quite useless and entirely uncommercial adventures.